Senator Rhiannon.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you for joining us from the Australian Meat Processing Corporation. When you look at the figures of the trends in trade between live exports and children and for processed meat, comparing processed meat to live exports, we're seeing there appears to be a shift. Could you explain the work that you undertake and the assistance that you're giving to rural producers involved in the cattle and sheep industry to benefit from the processing their meat in Australia so they can benefit from this increase in the international trade in processed meat?
Thank you, Senator. I'll start to address your question just by providing a short introduction, perhaps, in terms of the industry. The Australian meat processing industry nationally contributes around about 16.2 billion in gross domestic product, or 1.3% of total GDP. In that, 150,000 or so jobs are provided as part of that process, and our role, which you refer to as a corporation, is to administer and invest in research and development activities on behalf of meat processors, for which across our membership there's about 154 of those. And the breadth of activities that we undertake cover a range of programs in areas of market access, which is fundamental to our industry, as it is with all red meat industries. So we invest in market access activities to try and identify and maintain new or emerging markets, current markets. We invest in marketing activities. To do both of those programs, we partner with our collaborative organisations in the red meat supply chain, principally Meat and Livestock Australia. Further to that, we address matters of product integrity, food safety, quality, and a range of other activities relating to impacts on our industry as well, so climate change, capability and so forth. Now, I know that's an expansive answer, so to get to your point, across those activities we focus very carefully on our membership and where we apply those investments to further bring their products to market, and that does include the whole supply chain, and that's one of the bases for which we collaborate closely with Meat and Livestock Australia to address the producer needs equally to the processor needs for Australian supply chains.
So, you talked about the market activities. Are they limited because of the lack of abattoirs in Northern Australia?
Senator, I wouldn't say limited. It's difficult to answer simply on the basis that all of the supply chain arrangements are quite specific for particular markets. So our data shows us that stock can be moved, or about 60 to 70% of livestock can be moved from Northern Australia and processed around the nation. And some of that is dependent on the particular supply chain or the particular customer at a point in time. And with that, AMPC as a corporation doesn't or isn't able to monitor that on a daily basis. We can merely look at the previous literature to see where animals are moving to and where they're being slaughtered and supplied to particular markets and so forth.
So you're saying that by moving them to abattoirs in Southern Australia, we can supply that market?
At this stage, I can only comment to say that of the stock that originate in the north, a significant proportion are moved around, depending on the markets and depending on the locations of the specific plants that can process those animals.
So there is an abattoir, I understand, that will be opening up shortly in Darwin. Would you see that the trade could expand if there was more?
Certainly, that's been a discussion point across the industry for a fair period of time. There are lots of challenges in establishing operations in the north, I think it would depend on the particular commercial operator, but I see no reason why that would inhibit anything.
So does AMPC give advice to the government about that sort of thing? If your job is to be helping to promote the industry, is that something that you look at and then give advice on?
In this particular case, it's not likely that we would, merely because the establishment of works are predominantly a commercial decision, and I think that in this case it would be up to the commercial players to determine the factors that needed to be accounted for in establishing a business. So, for example, labour, logistics, capital costs and so forth. It's not something that as a research body we'd be advising on specifically.
Just moving over to another factor that appears to limit our trade, when you look at many of the Middle East countries like Kuwait and Qatar and Bahrain, there's many subsidies that they have in place on importing live sheep, and just that regulation of the market there that seems to disadvantage the processed meat market. Is that something that you give attention to ensure that, to help make that shift? Because it would appear that we're losing market share for meat products that are processed here.
Senator, our corporation doesn't specifically, merely because we outsource a lot of the market access and marketing activities through our partner organisation, Meat and Livestock Australia. Notwithstanding, commercial players engage the government on those sorts of trade issues rather than our corporation AMPC. But I certainly understand your question because it is something that is represented in literature. In general, it's just not
because I think it's widely
an area of focus. Yeah.
Sorry. I think it's widely acknowledged that without these subsidies, the live sheep trade to the Middle East would almost collapse overnight. So I thought that it would be something that you may give attention to in terms of your work, that how do we ensure that that there is a transition that is beneficial to Australian producers, and we're not left behind because we've relied on the export trade when internationally, like I gave the figures earlier about Asia, I mentioned Asia and China, where there's a huge growth in processed meat. How do we make sure we're taking advantage of this?
Senator, I can only comment, I think, with regards to the published literature on the topic established by a range of consultants over the last 10 to 15 years. In that, I will add that a range of modelling has been applied across those studies, and these aren't our studies, these are just generic works that have been undertaken by various groups. Now, the differences in modelling are clear in those reports. Notwithstanding, there are some similarities around benefits and costs or otherwise across the sectors. I think that to make any reasonable determination or to have an informed debate on those kinds of matters, I do consider looking at that literature, which is our only role, that further analyses would need to be undertaken because of the reliance of many supply chains on live export as well as Australian processing. And I don't consider in looking peripherally at those reports that significant analysis has been achieved at this point. But I think that debate would need to play out between the relevant industry sectors and, of course, government.
Are you aware of the ASIL Tasman report, an economic analysis of live cattle exports that came out this month? What's your assessment of that report?
I haven't reviewed the report extensively. It is one of the reports I was referring to with my previous comment. So I think that there's been a range of analyses that have looked at similar matters. I think, though, because of the variability across the supply chains, both domestically and, of course, in the live sector, further examination of specific factors would need to occur because a lot of these studies are qualitative. And that's where they need to begin, of course. But certainly it's not AMPC's role to progress any views or publications there.
So even though it's not to progress reviews about the publications, as a national research and development body that's there to represent the red meat processing industry, aren't these issues that you would be working on, considering there is this huge shift internationally, and Australia can get left behind if we're not giving advice to government about what needs to change?
Certainly, AMPC does invest in improving market access where it is beneficial to meat processors on behalf of the industry, and we do that in partnership with Meat and Livestock Australia. I think across a lot of these matters, we do look at variables that will impact our domestic supply and how our domestic supply should or could be improved. And as I said, those things are constantly being worked on, including all of our national marketing campaigns presently in collaboration with MLA.
So are you saying that you would see this more as MLA's responsibility? Because partly what I'm just trying to do here is also understand who does what. So are you saying MLA should be doing more of this work, or it's your work?
I'm saying that under our partnership together as Rural Research and Development Corporations, we outsource the project activities, specifically if we were talking economic analyses, to personnel at MLA to undertake. We can and will suggest areas that we might wish to examine, and these haven't included some of the specifics in the ASL report necessarily, but they do include areas of market access that we wish to further on behalf of meat processing.
And just a fairly specific question, and again, I'm hoping you can pick it up. So I'm still working out where you ask your questions here. For some of the producers, what they're raising with us is for female stock, and for the heavier stock, they're often finding it hard to get a market. So do you give it, is that something you're doing research on and giving advice on? What shifts those producers should make? Yeah,
not specifically from the corporation's perspective. That is traditionally advised by commercial players across the industry.
So in terms of herd performance, that's not something, you don't get down to that. I mean, again, I would have thought that would have led on to the success of those producers, as considering they're involved in the red meat trade, but they've got involved with stock that may not bring them much financial returns. Who looks at that?
Senator, I would suggest that you propose the question to Meat and Livestock Australia only on the basis that where an issue or an area of research concerns the supply chain, we act collaboratively with Meat and Livestock Australia. So with regard to your question around producer gains from particular kinds of stock in particular markets or particular nutritional regimes, etc., on a project-by-project basis, where it applies to meat yield or market access particulars, we would contribute investment in collaboration with MLA